Welcome back, everyone, to Mr. Cursed. In today's episode, I'm sharing 5 true scary stories about people who found creepy things in old, empty cabins in the mountains. These cabins have been left alone for years, and some really weird and scary stuff happens there. But before we start with these scary stories, please hit the subscribe button if you like this kind of stuff. Don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends. I'd also love to know where you're watching from. Leave me a comment. Thanks for watching my videos. It really helps me out. Now, let's get started. I'm 34 now, and I work for a small insurance company out of Richmond. It's not glamorous work. Mostly I drive around Virginia documenting car accidents and house fires, taking photos, interviewing people who are having the worst day of their life. But back in 2018, when I was 29, I thought I was pretty good at spotting fraud. I'd been doing it for 6 years, had a decent track record of catching people who staged accidents or burned down their own barns for the money. My supervisor kept hinting that if I could close a few more big cases, there might be a promotion waiting for me. That's how I ended up driving 3 hours into the mountains of Western Virginia to investigate what seemed like the most obvious insurance scam I'd ever seen. 3 hunters from Norfolk had filed a claim for $50,000. They said something had destroyed their hunting cabin and all their equipment. The thing that made me roll my eyes was their description of what did it. They claimed it was something inhuman, classic fraudster language, vague enough to avoid specifics, dramatic enough to make you think they were really scared. I'd seen it a dozen times before. Usually it was vandals or bears or sometimes lightning. But when people start throwing around words like inhuman, they're usually covering up the fact that they took a sledgehammer to their own property. The cabin was called Thornwood, built in the 1970s by the grandfather of one of the hunters. It sat on about 40 acres of forest land, completely isolated, no cell service, the kind of place where you could do whatever you wanted without anyone knowing. Perfect for staging fake destruction. The drive up there took me through increasingly narrow mountain roads until I was following what was basically a logging trail. GPS died about 10 miles before I got there, which was normal for that area. I had printed directions and a paper map. Figured I'd be back home by dinner with enough photos to prove these guys had taken a baseball bat to their own hunting lodge. I remember pulling up to the cabin around noon on a Tuesday in October. The leaves were just starting to turn, and it was one of those perfect fall days where the air is crisp but the sun still feels warm. I parked next to what was left of their truck, or what I assumed was their truck. The vehicle was completely destroyed. Windows smashed, tires shredded, metal twisted in ways that didn't make sense. My first thought was that they'd really gone overboard with the staging. Most people who fake property damage don't bother destroying their own cars. But when I got out and looked at the cabin itself, I stopped thinking about insurance fraud. The roof was gone. Not damaged, not partially collapsed. Completely gone. And it hadn't been torn off from the outside. The wooden beams were bent outward, like something had exploded from inside the cabin and punched through. I've documented tornado damage, house fires, even a case where someone's moonshine still blew up, but I'd never seen destruction like this. The logs that made up the walls had gouges in them that went 6 inches deep. Whatever made those marks had claws, and they were big. I started taking photos immediately. That's what you do in my job. Document everything. Worry about explanations later. I photographed the truck, the cabin exterior, the claw marks on the trees around the clearing. And there were a lot of claw marks. Fresh ones cutting deep into the bark about 7 feet off the ground. Way too high for a bear, way too big for anything else that lived in Virginia mountains. The smell hit me when I got closer to the cabin. It was thick and metallic, like old pennies mixed with something rotten. I breathed through my mouth and kept taking pictures. Inside the cabin was worse. The furniture wasn't just broken, it was shredded. Surgical precision, like something had taken apart every piece of wood and fabric with razors. The bloodstains were everywhere, dark, dried, covering the walls in patterns that made my stomach turn. I've seen plenty of blood at accident scenes, but this was different. Too much of it, and it was the wrong color, too dark, almost black in places. I took samples for the lab, photographed everything from multiple angles, measured the dimensions of the claw marks. Professional documentation. That's what I do. That's when I saw it watching me from the tree line. It was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, broad daylight, sun shining through the leaves. I was kneeling down photographing some particularly deep gouges in the hardwood floor when I felt like someone was staring at me. You know that feeling. I looked up and out through where the front door used to be. Something pale was standing between 2 oak trees about 50 yards away. Tall, really tall, and thin in a way that didn't look right. Even from that distance, I could tell its proportions were wrong. Arms too long, torso too narrow, head tilted at an angle that made my skin crawl. It was perfectly still, just watching me. I grabbed my camera and tried to zoom in, but when I looked through the viewfinder, it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, shadows playing games. But I'd been doing this job long enough to trust my instincts, and my instincts were screaming at me to leave. I ignored them. I had a job to do, and $50,000 in potential fraud to investigate. Over the next hour, I found the hunter's equipment scattered throughout the woods. Rifles snapped in half, hunting knives twisted into spirals, backpacks torn open with their contents spread in perfect circles around tree trunks. It looked ritualistic, like someone was marking territory. I photographed everything, but I was starting to move faster, checking over my shoulder more often. That's when I found what was left of the hunters. I don't want to describe what I saw. Even now, 6 years later, I still have nightmares about it. They weren't bodies. They were evidence. Evidence that something had been feeding. The lab reports later confirmed that the blood samples I'd collected didn't match any known species. Not human, not animal, nothing in their database. I was photographing the scene when I heard my car alarm going off. I ran back to the clearing and found my sedan completely destroyed. Every window smashed, all 4 tires slashed, hood ripped open with claw marks across the engine block, and carved into the paint on the driver's side door were 4 parallel lines, each about 3 inches wide. Territory markers. That's when I realized I wasn't investigating insurance fraud. I was being hunted. The thing in the trees had moved closer. I could see it clearly now, crouched on all 4s between the cabin and the forest. It looked like someone had stretched a person out on a medieval torture rack, elongating everything until the proportions became nightmare fuel. Pale skin that seemed to glow in the fading afternoon light, too many joints in its arms and legs, and eyes that reflected light like mirrors. It was studying me, learning. I could feel its intelligence, cold and alien and patient. I backed toward the cabin, keeping my camera between us like a shield. The thing tilted its head, mimicking my movements. When I raised the camera to take a picture, it raised one of its impossibly long arms. When I stepped left, it stepped left. It was playing with me. That's when it started talking. Not really talking, mimicking. It repeated words I'd spoken into my phone earlier, insurance terminology in my own voice. Property damage assessment, fraudulent claim investigation, photographic documentation. Hearing my own words coming from that thing's throat made my blood freeze. I spent the rest of the day trapping it inside the destroyed cabin, using broken furniture to barricade what was left of the doorway. The thing circled the building for hours, testing my defenses, scratching at the walls, calling out in voices that weren't its own. Sometimes it sounded like my supervisor at work. Sometimes it mimicked my ex-wife. Once it perfectly replicated my mother's voice calling my name. When darkness fell, it got bold. The attacks started around midnight. It would charge the cabin, test my barricades, retreat, then try again from a different angle. Each time, it got a little further inside before I could drive it back with camera flashes or by throwing pieces of broken furniture. It was learning my patterns, figuring out my weaknesses. Around 3 a.m, during a lightning storm that had started up, I realized it wasn't trying to kill me quickly. It could have broken through my defenses any time it wanted. This was entertainment. It was playing with its food. The final attack came just before dawn. Lightning lit up the sky as the thing smashed through my barricade like it was made of paper. I got a clear look at it up close. Skin like wet leather, fingers that ended in claws longer than kitchen knives, and those mirror eyes that seemed to see right through me. We fought in the ruins of the cabin. Me with a broken chair leg, it with those claws and impossible strength. I should have died. would have died if not for that storm. Lightning struck a tree just outside the cabin, splitting it in half and sending burning branches crashing down. The noise and light confused the thing just long enough for me to slip past it and run. I didn't stop running until I reached the main road 6 miles away. A state trooper found me around noon, covered in blood and mud, raving about monsters in the mountains. They took me to a hospital, patched up the claw marks on my arms and back, ran a psychological evaluation. When I took the authorities back to the cabin 2 days later, it was gone. Not just the creature, everything. The destroyed building, the ruined vehicles, teat, bloodstains, even the claw marks on the trees. The clearing was there, but it was empty, like nothing had ever been built there at all. The only evidence that remained were the photos on my camera and the scars on my body. I filed my insurance report exactly as it happened. My company paid the claim immediately and quietly transferred me to a desk job. Word gets around in the insurance business. I became known as the adjuster who'd had a breakdown in the mountains, who'd fabricated evidence of a monster attack to cover up his own incompetence. But other adjusters started coming to me with similar cases, claims that didn't make sense, property damage that followed impossible patterns, blood samples that didn't match anything in the lab databases. I developed a reputation for handling the weird cases, the ones nobody else wanted to touch. 5 years later, I've documented 17 similar incidents across Appalachia. Always remote locations, always hunting cabins or isolated homesteads, always the same territorial behavior and feeding patterns. I've built a network of insurance professionals who know what to look for, who can warn people to stay away from certain areas. I carry different equipment now: heavy-duty flashlights, emergency flares, a pistol loaded with hollow-point bullets that probably won't stop one of these things, but might slow it down long enough to run. I've saved dozens of lives by identifying active hunting territories and getting claims settled before people could go investigate the damage themselves. The scars on my arms still ache when it rains, perfectly parallel lines from my shoulders to my wrists, like the thing was marking me as its territory before I escaped. They're a reminder that some insurance claims are real, some property damage has inhuman causes, and some professional investigations lead to encounters with things that hunt human best for sport. I still do this job because someone has to. Someone needs to stand between ordinary people and the things that live in the deep mountains, in the spaces between civilization and wilderness, where old territories are still defended by creatures that remember when this land belonged to them. I just hope I never have to go back to Thornwood. Back when I was 28, I was running a YouTube channel called Forgotten Places. Nothing fancy, just me with a camera exploring abandoned buildings around West Virginia and eastern Kentucky. I'd gotten maybe 3,000 subscribers, documenting old mining camps and empty houses. The algorithm wasn't kind to small channels like mine, but I loved the work. There's something peaceful about places where time stopped, you know? At least that's what I used to think. I'd heard about Mill Creek Cabin from 3 different people over the course of a year. First was this old guy at a gas station near Beckley who mentioned it when he saw my camera gear. Said there was artwork up there that nobody could explain. Then a woman on a hiking forum posted about impossible bone sculptures she'd seen while backpacking. Finally, my buddy Marcus, who'd been exploring abandoned places longer than me, sent me a grainy photo from his phone. It showed what looked like a chandelier made entirely of bones hanging inside a cabin. "You gotta see this place, man," he texted. "But I'm telling you right now, I'm never going back." The cabin was about a 4-mile hike from the nearest Forest Service road, way up in the mountains between Fayetteville and Gauley Bridge. According to the property records I found online, it had been built in 1953 by a family named Henley, abandoned sometime in the early 70s. Nothing unusual about that. Lots of mountain families left their old homesteads when mining work dried up. I planned the trip for a Thursday in October. Weekdays were better for filming because you didn't have to worry about running into other hikers or hunters. I packed my usual gear: DSLR camera, backup batteries, LED panels for lighting, protein bars, and water. The forecast called for clear skies and temperatures in the low 60s, perfect weather for a hike and some filming. The Tracy, I'll started easy enough. Well-maintained Forest Service path that wound up through oak and hickory trees, just starting to turn colors. I was filming as I walked, doing my usual introduction about the history of the area and what I expected to find. The first mile was beautiful, exactly the kind of peaceful mountain scenery that made me love this work. But somewhere around the 2-mile mark, things started feeling off. It's hard to explain exactly what I mean by that. The trail looked the same, the trees looked normal, but something in the air had changed. It was too quiet for one thing. When you spend enough time in the mountains, you get used to the constant background noise. Birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling in the breeze. All of that just stopped. I mentioned it to the camera. Weird how quiet it got all of a sudden. Must be getting close to something. The temperature dropped too. Not gradually like you'd expect as you gained elevation, but suddenly. 1 minute I was comfortable in my long-sleeved shirt. The next I was wishing I'd brought a jacket. My breath started showing in little puffs, even though it had been 60 degrees at the trailhead. Around mile 3, I started finding things. The first was a hiking boot, sitting right in the middle of the trail. Size 11, Merrill brand, probably 5 or 6 years old based on the wear pattern. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands while the camera rolled. No obvious damage, no blood, just a boot that someone had apparently lost, or left behind. Found some gear here, I said to the camera. Probably just fell out of someone's pack. But hikers don't lose boots like that. You don't just walk out of a hiking boot and not notice. And who hikes with only one boot anyway? I left it where I found it and kept walking. A quarter mile later, I found a digital camera hanging from a tree branch. Nice Canon DSLR, similar to the one I was using. The lens cap was missing and the LCD screen was cracked, but when I popped out the memory card and checked it in my camera, there were photos on it. Recent photos. Most of them were normal hiking shots, trail views, mountain scenery, a few selfies of a young woman with short dark hair. But the last dozen or so photos were all of the same thing. Bones. Lots of them. Arranged in patterns and structures that looked almost architectural. The final photo showed the interior of a log cabin. The walls were covered in what looked like bone mosaics. Intricate patterns made from different-sized bones fitted together like puzzle pieces. Ribs formed spiraling designs. Arm and leg bones created geometric frameworks. Smaller bones filled in the spaces like grout. It was beautiful, in a way that made my stomach turn. I should have turned around right then. Every instinct I had was telling me to head back to my truck and forget about Mill Creek Cabin. But I'd come this far, and the footage I already had wouldn't make much of a video by itself. Plus, if there really was something this unusual up there, documenting it could be huge for my channel. So I kept hiking. The cabin sat in a small clearing about 50 yards off the main trail. From the outside, it looked normal enough. Typical Appalachian construction, log walls chinked with mud and moss, metal roof gone red with rust. The windows were intact, but dark. No obvious signs of damage or abandonment beyond what you'd expect from 50 years of mountain weather. I filmed my approach, keeping up the casual commentary that worked for my videos. All right, so this is Mill Creek Cabin. Built in the 50s, abandoned in the 70s. People have been talking about some kind of artwork inside, so let's see what we're dealing with. The front door was standing open. That struck me as odd immediately. Mountain people are practical about their buildings, even abandoned ones. You don't leave doors open for weather and animals to get in. But there it was, hanging wide open, like someone had just walked out and forgotten to close it behind them. I stepped up onto the small covered porch and peered through the doorway. The bones covered everything, not randomly scattered like you might expect from animals bringing in kills. These had been arranged with incredible precision and artistry. The walls were covered in intricate mosaics made from human and animal bones of every size. Vertebrae formed flowing vine patterns. Skulls, human skulls, were set into the walls at regular intervals like decoration. Ribs had been bent and shaped into complex geometric forms that shouldn't have been structurally possible. The furniture was made from bones, too. A chair crafted entirely from leg bones, fitted together without any visible joints or hardware. A table supported by what looked like modified human spines. Even the floorboards had been replaced with flat bones laid out in herringbone patterns. But it was the chandelier that really got my attention. It hung from the center of the main room, a massive structure made from hundreds of bones arranged in concentric circles. Arm bones formed the outer ring, with progressively smaller bones creating inner layers that spiraled down toward a center point. The whole thing was maybe 8 feet across and 5 feet tall, and every bone in it had been carved with tiny, intricate patterns. It was moving, not swaying like you'd expect from air currents. The bones were slowly rotating around each other, the entire structure rearranging itself in subtle ways while I watched. Bones would slide out of position, rotate 90 degrees, then lock back into place in a new configuration. The carved patterns seemed to shift and flow as the bones moved. I filmed it all, keeping my voice steady even though my hands had started shaking. So, this is definitely not what I was expecting. Someone has put a lot of work into this place. The bone arrangements they're actually really impressive from an artistic standpoint. I'm not sure how they're getting some of these structural elements to work. I stepped further into the cabin, camera rolling, trying to document everything. The deeper I went, the more elaborate the bonework became. There were archways made from curved bones that created impossible geometric shapes, walls that seemed to be growing new bone formations while I watched, sculptures that incorporated what were obviously human remains but arranged in ways that were undeniably beautiful. That was the worst part, honestly. It was beautiful. Whoever had created this understood composition, balance, artistic flow. This wasn't the work of someone mentally ill or randomly violent. This was the work of an artist who happened to use human bones as their medium. I spent maybe 20 minutes inside, filming everything I could see. The bone structures were so complex that I kept noticing new details. Tiny carved symbols, impossible engineering solutions, artistic techniques I'd never seen before. My channel specialized in abandoned places, but this wasn't abandoned. This was an active workspace. That's when I heard the footsteps on the porch. Not the heavy boots you'd expect from another hiker. These were light, careful steps, like someone walking on their toes. But they were too rhythmic, too perfectly spaced, like someone who had never learned to walk naturally. I turned toward the door, camera still recording, and saw it. The thing was maybe 7 feet tall, but impossibly thin, like someone had taken a normal person and stretched them vertically. Its arms hung down past its knees, ending in fingers that were too long and had too many joints. It moved like a praying mantis, all angular movements and sudden stops. Its skin was gray-white, like old bone, and it was naked except for what looked like jewelry made from small bones and teeth. When it moved its head to look at me, the motion was too fluid, rotating further than human necks are supposed to turn. But the worst part was its face. It was trying to look human, but getting all the details wrong. The proportions were off. Eyes too large, mouth too wide, nose too small. Like something that had heard descriptions of humans but never actually seen one. It looked at me for a long moment, tilting its head back and forth like a bird studying something interesting. Then it smiled, showing teeth that were definitely human, but way too many of them. "Artist," it said, in a voice that sounded like wind through dry leaves. "You appreciate?" I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except hold my camera and try to keep breathing. The thing stepped into the cabin, moving with that same unnatural grace. As it walked, bones throughout the room began shifting and rearranging themselves. The chandelier spun faster. Wall decorations flowed into new patterns. The whole space was responding to its presence. "Many visitors," it continued, running those two long fingers along the bone walls. "All bring inspiration. Tommy brought youth. Rebecca brought training. Michael brought organization. Elizabeth brought knowledge." It gestured to specific areas as it spoke, and I realized I was looking at artistic styles. Different sections of the room showed different approaches to bone work. Some more chaotic and energetic, others more classically composed, others systematically organized. "You bring documentation," it said, focusing those huge eyes on my camera. "Show world the work, yes?" That's when I understood what I was looking at. This wasn't just a display. This was a workshop. And every missing hiker, every lost camper, every person who'd disappeared in these mountains over the past few decades, they'd become part of the collection. The thing moved closer and I could smell it now. Old bones and dry earth and something sweet and rotten underneath. "You helped finish masterpiece, Dees," it said. "Your aesthetic sense, valuable. Your documentation, permanent." I ran. I don't remember dropping the camera, but I must have, because when I got to my truck 3 hours later, I didn't have it anymore. I just remember crashing through the woods, branches tearing at my clothes, lungs burning, legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. Behind me, I could hear that thing calling in its wind-through-leaves voice. "Artist, come back. Show world the work." I drove straight to the county sheriff's office and tried to report what I'd seen. Tried to explain about the bones and the missing people and the thing in the cabin. The deputy was polite, but obviously thought I was either lying or having some kind of breakdown. He took my statement but made it clear that without evidence, there wasn't much they could do. I went back the next week with 3 other people and GPS coordinates. The trail was there, the clearing was there, but the cabin was gone. Just an empty space where it had been, with no foundation or debris to suggest anything had ever been built there. That was 8 years ago. I never made another video for my channel, never went hiking alone again. I work in an office now, selling insurance, staying in well-lit places with other people around. But sometimes I check the missing person reports for the mountains of West Virginia, and sometimes I see photos that other urban explorers have posted online. Bone sculptures in other abandoned buildings, artistic arrangements that look familiar. I think it's still out there, still working, still looking for artists who can appreciate what it's creating. And honestly, part of me is still curious about that masterpiece it mentioned. Part of me wonders what it would have looked like when it was finished. That's the part that scares me the most. I'm 27 now, working as a project manager for a construction company in Charlotte. But back in 2019, I was still finishing up my business degree at App State. Me and my 4 best friends had this tradition. Every semester, we'd take one weekend trip together, just to keep our group tight. We'd been doing it since freshman year, and with graduation coming up in May, we knew this spring trip was probably our last one before everyone scattered across the country for jobs and real life. Devin, our resident outdoorsman, suggested this place called Shadowbark Cabin. He'd found it on some hiking forum, an old Forest Service station that had been abandoned sometime in the 90s. The thing was maybe 40 miles northeast of Boone, way up in the mountains where cell service cuts out and you're lucky if you see another human being for days. Devin promised us it would be perfect, isolated enough for us to drink and be loud without bothering anyone, sturdy enough to actually shelter us for the weekend, and remote enough to feel like a real adventure. Our group worked well together because we all brought different skills. Maria was pre-med, so she always packed this massive first aid kit and knew how to handle emergencies. Devin grew up hunting and fishing with his dad, so he understood the wilderness in ways the rest of us city kids didn't. Ashley was our photographer. She documented everything we did, always had her camera ready. Chris was our tech guy, the one who could fix phones and laptops, and always brought backup batteries for everything. And me, I guess I was the organizer. I made the plans, booked the cars, figured out who was bringing what food. We left Boone on a Friday morning in late March. The weather was perfect, one of those clear, crisp mountain days where you can see for miles. Devin navigated while I drove his Jeep, and the other 3 followed in Chris's Honda. The trailhead was marked on Devin's GPS, but just barely, more like a suggestion than an actual parking area. We had to hike about 3 miles through dense forest to reach the cabin, following an old Forest Service road that was more rocks and roots than actual path. The hike felt good, though. We were all laughing, making jokes, excited to have this time together before graduation split us up. Ashley kept stopping to take pictures of interesting trees or rock formations. Chris complained about carrying his heavy backpack full of electronics, but he was grinning while he did it. Maria pointed out different plants she recognized from her biology classes. It felt like the perfect start to our final adventure. When we finally reached Shadowbark Cabin, it exceeded our expectations. The building was solid, real log construction, not some cheap prefab. It had been abandoned long enough for nature to start reclaiming it, but not so long that it was falling apart. Moss covered parts of the roof, and vines grew up the walls. But the structure looked sound. There were 3 rooms inside, a main common area with an old stone fireplace, and 2 smaller rooms that probably used to be offices or storage. Perfect for our group. We spent that first afternoon getting settled. Devin and Chris gathered firewood while Maria and Ashley cleaned out the common room. I organized our food supplies and set up the camp stove. By evening, we had a decent little base camp established. The fire was crackling, we had music playing from Chris's Bluetooth speaker, and Ashley was already taking group photos. We cooked hot dogs and drank beer and told the same stories we'd been telling each other for 4 years. But somehow they felt different, knowing this might be the last time. That first night was perfect. We stayed up late around the fire playing cards and talking about our post-graduation plow. Hey, Dan. Maria had gotten accepted to medical school at Duke. Chris had a job lined up with a tech company in Austin. Ashley was planning to freelance and maybe travel for a year. Devin wanted to work for the Forest Service or maybe guide hunting trips. I had interviews scheduled with a couple companies in Charlotte. It was exciting but also sad, talking about how our lives were about to change completely. Around midnight, when we were all getting ready to crash, Devin mentioned something that stuck with me. He said the forest felt unusually quiet. No owl calls, no rustling in the bushes, none of the normal sounds you expect when you're camping in the mountains. At the time, I just figured it was because we were talking and making noise ourselves. But looking back now, I think that was the first sign something wasn't right. We slept well that first night, though. The next morning dawned clear and beautiful. Ashley was up early taking photos of the sunrise through the trees. Maria made coffee on the camp stove while Chris tried to get a cell signal to check the weather. Devin and I planned out a day hike to explore the area around the cabin. Everything felt normal and good. But during breakfast, Ashley showed us some of the photos she'd taken the evening before. Most of them looked great. Candid shots of us around the fire, group pictures, scenic forest views. But in a couple of the background shots, she'd captured some tracks in the dirt around the cabin. They looked almost human, but wrong somehow. Too long, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of the toes. And there were a lot of them. Like whatever made them had been circling the cabin multiple times. Devin studied the photos carefully. He'd seen pretty much every kind of animal track you could find in North Carolina, but he couldn't identify these. They were bipedal, definitely, but the stride was longer than human and the foot shape was all wrong. The disturbing part was how many there were and how they seemed to form deliberate patterns around our shelter. Like whatever made them had been Stu. Dyeing the cabin, planning something. Chris suggested maybe they were bear tracks that got distorted in the soft soil, but Devin shook his head. He'd seen plenty of bear prints, and these weren't even close. Bears don't walk on 2 legs for extended periods, and their paw shape is completely different. Maria wondered if they might be from someone else camping nearby, but the size was wrong for that too. These prints suggested something significantly larger than any of us. We decided to be more careful but not panic. Devin suggested we do our day hike as planned, but stick together and stay alert. We packed extra water and made sure someone always knew where everyone else was. Ashley brought her camera to document anything else unusual we might find. Chris packed his emergency radio and GPS. Maria double-checked her first aid supplies. The day hike started out normal enough. We followed an old trail that wound deeper into the mountains, away from the cabin. The forest was beautiful. Massive trees, clear streams, rock formations that had been there for thousands of years. But Devin's observation from the night before proved accurate. The silence was unnatural. In 4 years of camping trips, I'd never experienced woods this quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, no insects buzzing, just our footsteps and voices. About 2 miles from the cabin, we found more tracks. These were fresher, probably from that morning. They followed the trail we were hiking, but parallel to it, staying about 20 feet back in the tree line. Like something had been shadowing us without wanting to be seen. The tracks would appear in soft soil patches, then disappear on rocky ground, then reappear farther ahead. always maintaining that same distance from the trail. Ashley documented everything while Devin analyzed the print patterns. He noticed they showed signs of intelligence. The creature was choosing its path carefully, avoiding areas where it might leave obvious evidence, using natural cover to stay hidden. This wasn't random animal behavior. Something was deliberately tracking us, staying close enough to observe but far enough away to avoid detection. We cut the day hike short and headed back to the cabin. The return trip felt different, like we were being watched. Multiple times one of us would catch movement in their peripheral vision, but when we'd turn to look, nothing would be there. Chris kept checking his GPS to make sure we were heading in the right direction, because somehow the familiar landmarks from our morning hike looked different now. Back at the cabin, we found more evidence that something had been there while we were gone. Our food supplies had been investigated, not scattered or destroyed, but carefully examined. Cans had been moved and repositioned, like something with hands had been turning them over to study them. Our sleeping bags had been arranged in a neat line, which definitely wasn't how we'd left them. And there were more tracks, much clearer now, leading directly to and from our temporary camp. That's when things started getting really strange. Chris discovered his backup phone battery was completely drained, even though he'd fully charged it the night before and hadn't used it all day. Maria's digital thermometer was showing impossible readings: 34 degrees 1 minute, 78 degrees the next, then error messages she'd never seen before. Ashley's camera had dozens of photos on it that she didn't remember taking, all of them showing the interior of the cabin from angles that would be impossible unless someone extremely tall had been operating it. As the sun started setting, we made a group decision to pack up and head back to the cars. Something was clearly wrong, and none of us felt comfortable spending another night at Shadowbark Cabin. We'd been camping together for years, and we trusted each other's instincts. When the whole group feels unsafe, you listen to that feeling. But as we start packing our gear, they revealed themselves. 7 figures emerged from the tree line simultaneously, surrounding the cabin with precision that proved they'd been coordinating their movement. They were tall, maybe 7 feet, and vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched over frames that seemed too long and angular for any mammal. They moved with this fluid, predatory grace that reminded me of big cats, but bipedal. The most disturbing thing was their eyes. Large, dark, and completely focused on us with an intelligence that was unmistakably calculating. They weren't looking at us like animals looking at potential prey. They were studying us like researchers examining interesting specimens. They didn't attack immediately. Instead, they positioned themselves at strategic points around the cabin, cutting off our escape routes with tactical precision that demonstrated planning and communication. One stood directly between us and the trail back to our cars. 2 others flanked the sides of the cabin. The remaining 4 spaced themselves to prevent us from scattering into the forest. They communicated through these clicking sounds. Not random noise, but clearly organized language with patterns and responses. When one would click in a certain sequence, others would respond with different patterns. They were coordinating, making plans, discussing strategy right in front of us in a language we couldn't understand. The Alpha, if that's what it was, stood directly in front of the cabin's main entrance. It was slightly larger than the others, with more pronounced features and a bearing that suggested leadership. When it moved, the others adjusted their positions accordingly. When it clicked, they responded immediately. Jake, our unofficial group leader, stepped forward to face the Alpha directly. I could see him trying to project confidence and authority, the same way he handled group projects or organized our trips. But this wasn't a situation where human leadership skills meant anything. The creature studied him with curiosity, tilting its head at angles that seemed impossible for any spine I'd ever seen. Maria had backed against the cabin wall, still clutching her medical kit. I could see her analytical mind working, trying to understand what we were dealing with from a biological perspective. But these things defied easy classification. They had characteristics of primates, but also features that seemed reptilian or even something completely outside normal taxonomy. Devin had gone completely still, using his hunting experience to avoid triggering any aggressive responses. He understood predator behavior better than any of us, but I could tell these creatures exceeded anything in his experience. They were apex predators, but with intelligence that matched or exceeded our own. Ashley, incredibly, was still taking pictures. Her camera was clicking away as she documented the encounter, even though her hands were shaking. The creatures noticed this immediately. One of them approached her slowly, clearly fascinated by the technology. It didn't threaten her, but studied the camera with the same analytical interest it had shown for our food supplies. Chris had been trying to use his emergency radio, but the device was producing only static and electronic squealing. The creatures seemed to understand what he was attempting, because two of them moved to flank him, effectively preventing any communication attempts without directly attacking him. What happened next changed everything. The creature studying Ashley's camera began to mimic her actions, raising its hands as if holding an imaginary camera and making clicking sounds that seemed to imitate the camera's shutter. It wasn't mocking her. It was trying to understand what she was doing, showing genuine curiosity about human technology and behavior. This breakthrough led Jas to try a different approach. Instead of projecting authority, he began making slow, deliberate movements, showing his empty hands, demonstrating that we weren't armed or threatening. The alpha creature responded by taking a step back, giving us slightly more space while maintaining its strategic position. Over the next several minutes, a strange kind of communication developed. We realized these weren't mindless predators or monsters. They were intelligent beings with their own territorial claims and social structure. We had unknowingly invaded their established domain, and they were responding the way any intelligent species would to trespassers in their territory. The turning point came when Devin, using his knowledge of animal behavior, began demonstrating submission and respect for their territorial boundaries. He lowered his eyes, moved slowly, and gradually began gathering our gear in ways that clearly indicated departure. The creatures responded positively to these signals, allowing him to pack without interference. Ashley's photography became a bridge between our species. She showed the alpha some of the pictures she'd taken. Photos of our group, images of the cabin, scenic shots of the forest. The creatures studied these with intense fascination, apparently understanding that they were representations of reality. In return, it began pointing to different locations around the cabin, clicking in patterns that seemed to convey territorial information. The negotiation, if that's what it was, lasted maybe 20 minutes. Gradually, the creatures allowed us to pack our gear and prepare to leave. They maintained their strategic positions, but no longer as an aggressive containment, more like an escort, ensuring we departed their territory properly. Jake managed the logistics of our departure, coordinating with the creatures through gestures and body language. Marsors, yet provided medical assistance when Chris scraped his arm on a tree branch while packing, and the creatures watched this interaction with scientific interest, clearly noting our cooperative, social behaviors. Devin led us back toward the trail, moving at a pace the creatures seemed to approve of, not running in panic, but purposefully departing their territory. Ashley continued documenting the experience, and the creatures allowed this, seeming to understand that she was recording history rather than gathering intelligence for future attacks. Chris discovered that his electronic equipment began functioning normally again once we moved beyond a certain distance from the cabin. His GPS locked onto satellites, his radio picked up clear signals, and his phone showed full battery life. Whatever had been interfering with our technology was localized to that specific area. The escort ended at a creek maybe half a mile from the cabin. The creatures stopped there, clicking among themselves in what sounded like discussion or confirmation. Then they simply melted back into the forest, disappearing with the same coordinated precision they'd shown when first revealing themselves. We completed the hike back to our cars in silence, each of us processing what had just happened. At the trailhead, everything returned to normal. Cell service resumed, our vehicles started without problems, and the familiar world of roads and civilization welcomed us back. But the experience changed all of us permanently. Jake became much more collaborative in his leadership style, having learned that authority means nothing when you're not the apex species in the environment. Maria ended up specializing in wilderness medicine, partly because of her fascination with the biological questions raised by our encounter. Devin now works as a specialized guide for researchers studying cryptid reports, using his experience to help scientists investigate similar territorial behaviors in remote areas. Ashley shifted her photography focus to indigenous cultures and undocumented communities, becoming much more thoughtful about the ethics of documentation and representation. Chris developed an interest in communication technology that functions in remote areas, eventually designing equipment specifically for researchers working in regions with unusual electronic interference patterns. We made an unspoken agreement to keep the specific location secret. Ashley has the photos, and they're remarkable evidence, but we've never shared them publicly or revealed the exact coordinates of Shadowbark Cabin. Those creatures earned our respect through their intelligence and restraint. They could have killed us easily, but chose negotiation instead. The least we could do was protect their territorial privacy. 4 years later, we still take annual camping trips, but now we research locations carefully first. We've developed contacts in the cryptozoology community, and we quietly share information about areas that might harbor similar intelligent territorial species. The goal is preventing other groups from accidentally invading established territories and creating conflicts that could end badly for everyone involved. Looking back now, I realize how lucky we were. That encounter could have ended in tragedy if we'd responded differently, or if those creatures had been less intelligent and diplomatic. Instead, it became proof that coexistence is possible between humans and other intelligent species, as long as both sides show appropriate territorial respect and recognition. I still think about them sometimes, wondering what their society is like, how long they've been in those mountains, what they think about the increasing human presence in their region. I hope they're doing well, and I hope other hikers are smart enough to recognize territorial boundaries when they encounter them. That experience taught me that the world is much larger and more complex than I'd ever imagined, and that intelligence comes in forms we might not immediately recognize. Sometimes the best resolution to a conflict is simple mutual respect, and the wisdom to know when you're not in your own territory anymore. I'm 34 years old, and I work in IT support for a small company in Charlotte. 3 years ago, I was going through what you'd call a rough patch. Divorce papers were fresh, and I was trying to figure out how to be a good dad when I only got to see my 8-year-old daughter Emma every other weekend. The whole custody thing was eating at me. I wanted to prove I could still be the father she needed, even if I couldn't be there every day like before. That's what led me to rent this cabin up near Boone, North Carolina, thinking maybe a weekend in the mountains would help us reconnect. The place was called Pine Haven Cabin, and from the online photos it looked perfect. Restored family cabin, fishing pond out back, hiking trails nearby. I figured we could do some fishing, maybe roast marshmallows, tell stories by the fire. All that wholesome father-daughter stuff I'd been missing out on since the separation. Emma had been pretty quiet during our weekend visits, still adjusting to everything that had changed, and honestly, I was trying way too hard to make up for it. We drove up on a Friday afternoon in October 2017. The leaves were turning, and Emma actually perked up during the drive, pointing out different colored trees and asking if we could collect some for a school project. For the first time in months, I felt like maybe I was getting somewhere with this whole part-time dad thing. The cabin sat about 2 miles off the main road, down a gravel drive that wound through thick pine trees. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. Rustic but comfortable, with a big stone fireplace and windows that looked out over the forest. That first day went better than I'd dared to hope. We caught 3 decent-sized trout from the pond, and Emma got so excited when she landed her first fish that she started jumping around on the dock. We hiked one of the shorter trails, and she collected Leah, Vess, and interesting rocks, chattering about school and her friends in a way she hadn't done in months. After dinner, we sat by the fire, and I told her some of the same stories my dad used to tell me when I was her age. She fell asleep on the couch, and I carried her to the bedroom, feeling like maybe I was finally figuring out how to be her dad again. But that night, things started feeling off. I'd always been a light sleeper, especially since the divorce. Part anxiety, part being alone in a new place every other weekend. Around midnight, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps on the cabin's front porch. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone was pacing back and forth. I lay there listening, trying to decide if I should get up and check. The steps stopped after maybe 10 minutes, but something about the silence that followed felt wrong. Not peaceful quiet. More like something was out there, waiting. The next morning, Emma was clingy in a way that wasn't like her. She usually loved exploring new places, but she kept close to me, holding my hand even when we were just walking from the cabin to the car. When I asked if she'd slept okay, she just nodded, but her eyes kept darting to the tree line like she expected something to come out of the woods. We tried to keep the day normal, more fishing, another hike on a different trail, but Emma kept looking over her shoulder, and twice she asked if we could go back to the cabin earlier than planned. The second time we were heading back, she stopped on the trail and grabbed my arm. "Dad," she said, and her voice was small. "Something's watching us." I looked around, but all I saw were trees. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "I don't know. Just hungry eyes, like it wants something." Kids have active imaginations, especially after everything she'd been through with the divorce. I figured she was just picking up on my own nervousness about making this weekend perfect. But looking back now, I should have listened to her. That second night, the temperature in the cabin dropped. I mean, really dropped. Cold enough that I could see my breath, even with the fire going. Emma crawled into bed with me around 2 a.m., shivering and whispering that she smelled something bad. I couldn't smell anything myself, but she was genuinely scared, not just making it up for attention. "It smells like when food goes bad in the refrigerator," she said. "But worse, like it's been bad for a really long time." I held her close and tried to warm her up, but the cold seemed to be coming from inside the walls themselves. The next morning, the temperature was back to normal, and I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. On our last day, Emma refused to leave the cabin. Not in a bratty way. She was genuinely terrified of going outside. She kept pointing at the windows and saying she could see something moving in the trees, something that was too tall and too thin to be human. I looked where she pointed, but I never saw anything except shadows and branches. It wasn't until that afternoon that I saw it myself. We were packing up to leave when Emma started screaming. Not the kind of scream kids do when they're playing or upset. This was pure terror. I ran to the window where she was standing, and that's when I saw what she'd been trying to tell me about. There was something at the edge of the tree line. At first glance, it looked almost human. 2 arms, 2 legs, standing upright. But everything was wrong. Too tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet. Arms that hung down past where its knees should be. And it was thin. Not just skinny, but emaciated, like it hadn't eaten in months or years. The worst part was how it moved. Not walking exactly, but sliding between the trees like it wasn't quite solid. And it was looking right at us, right at Emma. I scooped her up and carried her to the car, throwing our bags in the back without bothering to pack them properly. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. The whole time that thing just stood there at the tree line watching us. The car wouldn't start. I tried again. Nothing. Not even the sound of the engine turning over. Emma was crying now, pointing at the windows and saying it was getting closer. I looked up, and she was right. The thing had moved maybe 20 feet closer to the cabin, and I could see more details I wished I couldn't. Its skin was gray and hung loose like it had lost a lot of weight very quickly. Its fingers were too long, with joints in places that didn't make sense. But the worst part was its face. It looked hungry. Not just physically hungry, emotionally hungry, like it wanted to feed on something inside us. I kept trying the car while Emma sobbed in the passenger seat. On the 6th try, the engine finally caught, and I gunned it down that gravel drive faster than was safe. In the rear-view mirror, I saw the thing follow us to the edge of the driveway, but it didn't come onto the road. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Emma fell asleep about halfway back to Charlotte, exhausted from being scared for 3 days straight. I spent the drive trying to convince myself we'd both imagined it, but I knew that wasn't true. The weird thing is, that weekend actually helped our relationship. Going through something like that together, even something I still don't fully understand, made Emma trust me more. She knew I'd protected her when it mattered. Our custody visits got easier after that, And eventually, I was able to get more time with her. But I never took her camping again, and I've never been back to those mountains. Sometimes Emma still asks about what we saw at the cabin. She's 11 now, old enough to want real answers. I tell her the truth, that some things in this world are hungry for more than just food, and they're drawn to families that are hurting. But yet I also tell her that sometimes when people stick together and take care of each other, those hungry things can't get what they need. I still don't sleep great, and I never rent cabins online anymore without doing serious research first. But Emma and I are closer now than we were before the divorce, and I think that thing at Pine Haven Cabin, whatever it was, had something to do with that. It wanted to feed on our fear and our broken family, but instead, it helped us figure out how to be a family again. I've looked up the cabin since then, out of curiosity. The website is still up, but the reviews from the last few years paint a pretty consistent picture. Families going through rough times, kids complaining about being watched, parents finding excuses to cut their trips short. Always the same pattern. Stressed families, hungry eyes in the woods, and temperatures that drop for no reason. I won't tell you not to go, but if you do, make sure you're going with people you trust. And if your kids start talking about something watching them from the trees, maybe it's time to pack up and head home. I'm 31 years old and work as a wildlife photographer for National Geographic. Most people think that sounds like a dream job, and honestly, it usually is. But there's one assignment I did about 7 years ago that changed everything for me. I still wake up sometimes feeling phantom pain where my left hand used to be, and I have to remind myself that I'm safe in my apartment in Denver, not back in those mountains. I was sent to document winter wildlife migration patterns in the Appalachians, specifically around an area in West Virginia where researchers had noticed some unusual animal behavior. Nothing too dramatic, just deer populations shifting earlier than normal, bird species abandoning territory they'd used for decades. The kind of subtle changes that most people wouldn't notice, but could indicate larger environmental shifts. The assignment took me to an old ranger station called Deadfall Cabin, about 40 miles from the nearest town. It had been abandoned for maybe 15 years, but the structure was still solid, and it gave me a perfect base camp in the middle of the migration route. I'm not like those horror movie idiots who go into the woods with just a cell phone and a flashlight. I came prepared. Long-range camera lenses, motion sensors, night vision equipment, even a satellite communication device that could work anywhere. The first day went exactly as planned. I got some incredible shots of elk moving through the valley, documented a family of black bears preparing for winter, normal stuff that would make great footage for the documentary team. But even that first afternoon, I started noticing something odd. The animals seemed jumpy, more than usual, I mean. A deer would be grazing peacefully, then suddenly bolt like it had been shot, even when there was no sound, no movement, nothing that should have spooked it. By evening, I was reviewing my footage and realized I hadn't captured a single bird call all day. In mountains that should have been full of winter birds, there was nothing, just this heavy silence that made my ears ring. I told myself it was probably just a weather pattern, maybe a storm coming in that the animals could sense before I could. That night, I set up my motion sensors around the cabin's perimeter. These things are sensitive enough to pick up a rabbit from 50 yards away, and I wanted to document any nocturnal animal activity. Around 2 a.m., I was reviewing the day's photos on my laptop when I heard the first sound from underneath the cabin. It started as scratching, like maybe a raccoon or possum had gotten into the crawl space. But then I heard clicking sounds, rhythmic and deliberate. Almost like someone typing on a keyboard, but with longer pauses between clusters of clicks. I grabbed my audio equipment and started recording, thinking maybe I'd stumbled onto some rare nocturnal behavior. The clicking went on for about 20 minutes, then stopped completely. When I checked my motion sensors the next morning, they hadn't detected anything, nothing at all, which should have been impossible if animals were moving around under the cabin. The second day, the wrongness got stronger. I documented 3 different deer that stood perfectly still for over an hour each, not grazing, not looking around, just waiting, like they were listening for something. My camera picked up a fox that walked in a perfect circle 17 times before disappearing into the tree line. Normal animal behavior has patterns, reasons. This felt choreographed. That afternoon, I decided to use my ground-penetrating radar to check the area around the cabin. It's specialized equipment I usually use to locate underground animal dens for filming. What I found made no sense. There was a massive hollow space beneath the cabin, extending in tunnels that stretched for hundreds of yards in every direction. Not natural caves. These tunnels were too uniform, too deliberately constructed. The clicking started again, that night, but this time it wasn't just coming from under the cabin. I could hear it from multiple directions, like a conversation happening in the woods around me. I set up my night vision camera and pointed it out the window, hoping to catch whatever was making the sounds. What I saw through that camera still gives me nightmares. They moved on all fours, but their proportions were all wrong. Too long, too pale, like someone had stretched a person until all the joints bent the wrong way. Their hands were massive, with fingers that ended in what looked like climbing claws. And they moved with purpose, coordinating with each other through those clicking sounds. I counted at least 12 of them in the clearing around the cabin, and they were studying my equipment. Not destroying it, not running from it. Examining it like scientists. One of them picked up my spare tripod and turned it over in its hands, clicking rapidly to the others. Another one was crouched next to my truck, running those long fingers along the tire treads. I should have left then. Should have packed up my gear and gotten the hell out of there. But I'm a photographer, and what I was seeing was impossible. A new species displaying intelligence and social behavior that could rewrite everything we know about human evolution. I kept filming. They knew I was watching. One of them turned toward my window and looked directly at my camera. Its eyes reflected the infrared light like an animal's, but there was intelligence behind them. Recognition. It clicked something to the others, and they all stopped what they were doing to look at the cabin. That's when I realized they weren't just studying my equipment. They were learning how to use it against me. The attack came on the third night. I was woken up by the sound of scratching directly above my head. They were on the roof. Then the walls. Then I heard my satellite communication device power on outside, followed by the whirring sound of my motion sensors being deliberately triggered in sequence. They had learned how my equipment worked and were using it to coordinate their assault. I grabbed my camera bag and the most important memory cards, then barricaded myself in the cabin's back room. Through the window, I could see dozens of them emerging from holes in the ground I hadn't noticed before. This wasn't a pack, it was a colony. A whole underground civilization that had been watching human activity in these mountains for who knows how long. The front door splintered, then the windows. They poured into the cabin like water, moving with that same disturbing coordination I'd been filming. But they weren't trying to kill me immediately. They were hurting me, forcing me toward the back of the cabin where I could hear more scratching sounds. They wanted to take me underground. I used everything I had as weapons. Camera flashes to blind them temporarily, heavy telephoto lenses as clubs, tripod legs to block their grabbing hands. But there were too many, and they were learning my defensive patterns as fast as I could think of them. When they finally cornered me, I did the only thing I could think of. I smashed out the back window and dove through it, not caring about the 15-foot drop to the ground. Something grabbed my left hand as I fell, and I felt bones crack, but I kept running. They followed me into the woods, clicking and calling to each other in the darkness. I could hear them in the trees above me, in the underbrush on both sides, coordinating a pursuit that would have impressed military tacticians. But I knew these mountains from 3 days of photography, and they didn't expect me to understand how their tunnel entrances were laid out. I made it to my truck and got the engine started, but one of them managed to grab my left hand through the driver's side window as I was pulling away. I made a choice, floored the accelerator, and let the creature's weight rip my hand off at the wrist rather than be dragged back to whatever was waiting for me in those tunnels. I drove 40 miles with one hand, bleeding all over the steering wheel, before I found a hospital. The doctors couldn't explain the bite patterns on my wrist. They didn't match any known animal. They wanted to know what had attacked me, but how do you explain an underground civilization of intelligent predators that had been studying human behavior? The police thought I was delusional from blood loss until they saw my camera footage. Hours of video documentation showing organized, intelligent creatures using tools and coordinating complex hunting strategies. The footage ended up classified, but not before several cryptozoologists and cave specialists confirmed what I'd discovered. There's a whole species down there. They've been sharing this planet with us for thousands of years, staying underground, studying us, occasionally hunting us when they need to expand their territory. The deadfall colony, as the researchers started calling it, was just one of many. I adapted to the prosthetic hand and kept working, but now I specialize in training other wildlife photographers to recognize the signs of these underground territories. We've found 17 more colonies across the Appalachians, all centered around abandoned human structures they use as surface observation posts. The weird thing is, after 7 years of studying them, I've started advocating for their protection. They're intelligent, they have a complex society, and they were here long before European settlers arrived. The fact that they hunt humans is horrifying, but it's also just what apex predators do when their territory is threatened. Sarah Chen, that's my full name, and I'm probably the only person on Earth who can say they've lived among them and survived to document it. The footage I shot at Deadfall Cabin remains the primary evidence that we share this planet with another intelligent species. Sometimes I wonder if they remember me. If they know that the woman with one hand who advocates for their habitat protection is the same person who escaped their colony 7 years ago. But I'll never go back to find out. Looking back now, I think that's probably for the best.